This week on the Catholic Vote Radio Hour.
This is the guy who has invited very nutty people to conferences at the Vatican.
Right. A prominent cleric at the Vatican claims that communist China is the best at implementing Catholic social teaching. I talked with CFAM's Austin Ruse about why that's nonsense.
Kids can choose their own gender, which is yet to be determined, but their political ideology is set in stone.
Carly Hoilman and I talk about how one Super Bowl ad is especially creepy.
The Bishops' Conference ends up blunting its witness by treating all of these issues as if they're equally susceptible to a Catholic answer.
Dr. Jay Richards, host of EWTN's A Force for Good, explains what Catholic social teaching isn't and how subsidiarity can save lives.
In the early days of broadcasting, few people realized what a fine art radio was to become.
Hello, you're listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour, the show that's so influential, the FBI tapped our phones in 2016. I'm your host, Stephen Herreid.
Posing as refugees from enemy-occupied territory, they plan to send their messages under cover of darkness. So keep a lookout for such sneaks.
First up, it's Last Week in Review. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau recently interrupted a woman at a town hall to explain to her that her use of the word mankind was offensive. We like to use the word peoplekind, he said. Accused of manterrupting and mansplaining, Trudeau was offended again. I was person-terrupting and person-splaining. Person alive, persons. I'm only you, person. The head of the Vatican's Pontifical Academy for Science and Social Sciences, Archbishop Marcelo Sorondo, said this week that Communist China is the best implementer of Catholic social teaching. Miraculously, all of China's government officials offered to convert, saying that they would have converted years ago if they had only known that Catholics were allowed to persecute Catholics. Jesuit Father James Martin has announced a second edition of his book, Building a Bridge. The new edition will be released in March under the title, Building Another Bridge, 101 Things Jesus Can Learn from Me. After previously promising otherwise, Notre Dame University has announced that it will be covering contraceptives in its healthcare plans. It's a complex issue, President Jenkins explained. On the one hand, there are the teachings of Christ and his church. On the other hand, there is the wide road that leadeth to perdition. Hard to know what Jesus would do. Newly released memos have confirmed that the Clinton campaign and the FBI conspired to surveil the Trump campaign during the 2016 presidential race. Several officials are set to testify against Hillary Clinton. They released this statement to the American public. Quote, "In lieu of flowers, just pray for our families." This has been the Week in Review. You're listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour. And now I'm joined by Austin Ruse. He's the president of CFAM, otherwise known as the Center for Family and Human Rights, which is what it sounds like, a human rights organization that works a lot in international worries about human rights. And he does great work, and thank you for joining the show.
Delighted to be here.
So, Austin, I'm pretty depressed this week because the news cycle from a Catholic perspective, especially with regard to the Vatican and China, has been really awfully deflating. About a week ago, it was reported in the Catholic Herald that a Vatican delegation asked a bishop to step down to make way for a state-appointed bishop. In fact, the state-appointed bishop this action was meant to make way for had previously been illicitly empowered by the state, a communist state that persecutes the church. And there's forced abortion, of course. There's the infamous one-child policy. So that's the context. Catholics are very worried, including the heroic Cardinal Zen, the underground Catholic church in China that barely survives despite a bigoted and anti-Catholic communist government. And then this week, the Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, Bishop Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo, said that one of the best implementers of Catholic social teaching is the Chinese state, which is, again, a brutal state. So what is this?
Well, one of the most interesting things that I ever heard anyone say about the church in China was by the Canadian novelist Michael O'Brien. He said there are estimates that 10% of the population in China are Christian of various kinds, a large portion of them Catholic.
Wow.
And he said that would make the church in China the largest church in the world.
Wow.
I never considered it in those particular terms. He also pointed out there are faithful Catholics in the patriotic church. Not everybody wants to risk everything to go to the underground church. It's kind of interesting and much more complicated than what we're hearing today.
Right.
Yeah, getting cozy with the communist regime is always problematic. I kind of want to give the Vatican a bit of the benefit of the doubt. You have to think that they are concerned about the faithful Catholics who are in the patriotic church. But I mean, quite honestly, this is way beyond my competence. Sure. Where I can comment is on Archbishop Sanchez Sorondo and what he said, which I think is just plainly appalling.
Yeah.
Because China is an oppressive regime.
Yeah.
And forces abortion on women who have too many pregnancies.
Right.
And to say that China most accurately participates in Catholic social teaching, to me, is just a chin scratcher. But this is the guy who has invited very nutty people to conferences at the Vatican.
Right.
Jeffrey Sachs, who's an enemy of the church at the UN now for 20 years, former Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, who has openly warred with Catholic social teaching at the UN and promotes a radical left agenda on human sexuality. They have places of honor at the Vatican. I'm not invited to the Vatican anymore. Others like me are not invited to the Vatican anymore. We used to be, but now it goes to guys like Jeffrey Sachs and Ban Ki-moon and others who even have more appalling ideas than these guys.
Right.
So it's a disappointment that somebody like Sanchez Sorondo would say things like this. We tangled with Sanchez Sorondo a few years ago on the question of global warming, in which he flat out said that opponents of the global warming theory all were in the employ of the oil industry.
Right.
It made news all over the world, and then we were trashed by Margaret Archer, who's president of the Pontifical Academy on Social Sciences. Yeah. She was like mocking us. She goes, basically, yeah, we're on the inside and you're on the outside. I mean, she was now,
if I may, Austin, I wrote this up for The Blaze when I was writing for The Blaze at the time. I'd like to actually just quickly read a little bit of that, because I couldn't believe what I was reading. This was in 2015, I believe. We're talking about the Archbishop and Margaret Archer is the president of the Pontifical Academy. I was worried about Pope Francis at the time because he was hiring, as I wrote, zealous proponents of abortion as advisors on economic issues in particular. So I'm quoting myself here in The Blaze. When Catholic intellectuals and policy analysts question this, the spokespeople of the Vatican are by no means subtle in their contempt for the pro-life cause. In response to questions from pro-life analyst Stefano Generini, which is your colleague, Pope Francis is Chancellor of the Pontifical Academies of Science and Social Sciences, Archbishop Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo, had this to say, quote, "The Tea Party and all those whose income derives from oil have criticized us, but not my superiors, who instead authorized me, and several of them participated." This was surrounding the controversy of Ban Ki-moon helping out at the Vatican. The Archbishop chided that pro-lifers who claim to be pro-life ought to be happy about the Vatican's working with pro-abortion advisors because they offer, quote, access to family planning and sexual reproductive health and reproductive rights, which helps poor families. Reproductive rights, as we all know, is a code word for abortion rights. Margaret Archer, the president of the Pontifical Academy, was even less forgiving and accused pro-lifers of, quote, a travesty of Catholic social teaching. She even used the old pro-abortion cliche, quote, "Is your sole concern with human dignity confined to the period between conception and live birth?" Invoking Pope Francis, she pointed out that I am appointed by the Pope and responsible directly to him. I'm afraid that leaves you and your cohort out in the cold. She venomously concluded, adding, "Which lobbyists meet your salary bill?" I mean, this is really venomous.
Yeah, very elitist and snotty. She goes, "I'm afraid that leaves you and your cohort out in the cold." And boy, that's true. We are out in the cold. There's no question about that. In terms of genuinely working with people in the Secretariat of State in Rome and the other dicasteries, we and others are out in the cold. And I know many people who work at the Vatican who are thoroughly dispirited, worried about keeping their jobs, keeping their heads down. But when somebody like Sanchez Sorondo can say the things that he has said with impunity, it just goes to show you that we are well and truly out in the cold.
Here's the thing that really bothers me. In the first 2 years of the Francis pontificate, I was worried because there were certain people, like you mentioned, finding themselves out in the cold all of a sudden. What I heard a lot from my Catholic friends is, "Oh, Stephen, you right-winger. You're just concerned for members of your right-wing tribe." And like Sorondo says, what is his worry? What is he paranoid about? What does he want nowhere near the Vatican? The Tea Party. I mean, these people are focused specifically on the American anti-left, I'll call it. And first of all, it's clear the Vatican is participating in American politics in this sense. They're aware of the terms of it, and they are on a side of it, and it happens to be on the left. But secondly, especially now that we're talking about the context of China. We're talking about an ideology that was responsible for the majority of 20th century martyrdoms. Communism is responsible for the slaughter, starvation, rape, and murder of countless Christian and non-Christian victims, innocent victims. And we're talking about a leftist ideology. And to act like we're supposed to be indifferent to this is callous and frankly bigoted. And when I hear that kind of thing, look, as a Christian, I'm offended by your downplaying this in a way that's actually analogous to the way Poles or Jews might feel offended by you downplaying the Holocaust. Yeah. It's absolutely devastating to hear that kind of thing. It gets my blood boiling, and it should get my blood boiling. Any Christian with red blood should be responding to that with saying, you've got to be kidding me. This is not a matter for consequence-free, no-stakes chitter-chatter. We should be putting up memorials to victims of the ideology that you're just casually saying is pretty good. And what I'm really worried about is the Tea Party and the oil companies. What on earth is a Catholic leader talking about? That is so deeply offensive to me.
Yeah, there's no question. And consider that many of the victims of communism in China, without a doubt, were Christians and Catholics. So yeah, it's dispiriting that Sorondo would have such free reign and feel so free to say things that are deeply offensive and ought to be deeply offensive to everybody. And so far, one of the things that I've noticed is the utter silence from the Francis echo chamber. I haven't seen any criticism at America, and what we'll probably see is an explanation, just an unpacking, and what he really means, or other outright defenses from America, Austin Ivory, Massimo Fagioli. They have, I think, been silent, and I suspect that if they do say anything, it will be in defense of what he said. So yeah, there's a very funny thing going on these days, not just with people like Sanchez Sorondo, but also the echo chamber here in the United States, which, by the way, my column at Crisis this week is going to be about the echo chamber's silence on the 14 Catholic senators who voted against the ban on abortion for children at 20 weeks. America has only run one column, and the point of that column was not that these senators had voted against it, but golly, it was a wedge issue used by the Republicans to try and take seats away from Democrats in red states. That was their take. And as far as I know, Commonweal has been silent. I think Crux has been silent. Right. They might have run one. So to me, and this will be the title of my column, the seamless garment is dead, and it deserved it. It was always a fraud. This kind of proves that the seamless garment was a fraud. And here we go with this notion of Catholic social teaching being better reflected in Red China than any other place. We're through the looking glass.
Yeah. In many circles, Catholic socialist teaching is really what it should be called. Catholic social teaching. After all, I mean, it really is just a synonym for leftist priorities, which is unfortunate because Catholic social teaching, the real thing, is a treasure trove of wisdom. And we've neglected that. I'll be talking later with Jay Richards to try to get some things right about Catholic social teaching as opposed to Catholic socialist teaching.
Catholic social teaching could include eliminating the capital gains tax. It could include eliminating the tax on corporations, because as we see with the Tax Reform Act of a few weeks ago, it has had a profound effect on people's pocketbooks. And now we see the lowest unemployment rate in the history of African Americans in this country, also Latinos, also women. So I would say that Donald Trump and the Republicans are more in line with Catholic social teaching than the Democrats.
Right. Well, and that's
in America.
And that's not hard. When you've got people apologizing for 20th century communism, the most murderous ideology in human history, which, in addition to continuing to persecute the church, is also sanctioning forced abortion and state-mandated atheism in places like Cuba and China. It's not hard. The onus is on you if you're on that team. The onus is not on me to show that, I don't have to morally defend why I'm an anti-leftist after the bloodbath that was the 20th century.
Right.
The onus is on you. What on earth are you doing playing footsie with forced atheism and all of these other horrific things that were always persecutory toward the church?
You should have Lee Edwards come on and talk about this, or somebody from the Victims of Communism Foundation.
Yeah, I should.
Who is also Catholic. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry I got so angry, Austin, but I will calm down now.
I wish you well.
All right. Well, God bless, and thank you for the good work you do, and I can't wait to have you on again.
Thanks, man. Anytime.
And now I'm joined by Carly Hoilman, columnist with Catholic Vote, to talk about a very interesting week of news relating to toddlers and babies. First of all, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Like I said, there's this running theme throughout the week I thought was really interesting. First of all, on Sunday, the Super Bowl.
By the way, Stephen, the only reason I agreed to be on this podcast this week was to give a little shout out to the Eagles, because I am an Eagles fan and I do watch the Super Bowl. So Philly.
Oh, wow.
And I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but I did.
I don't know, Carl. I don't know how many Bradyacks are among our listeners. I really don't know. But anyway, yeah, I saw a T-Mobile ad that was an Orwellian commercial, and it featured an eerie, sort of meandering shot of babies gazing upwards into a bright light, while a voiceover told them, "You will fight for equal pay. You will love whom you want to love." And on the one hand, it's awful creepy to be talking to babies about sodomy.
Yeah.
The silver lining is that the babies looked totally unconvinced. I guess when you crap yourself once an hour and can't survive without breast milk, fighting for equal pay isn't exactly top of mind. So it was pretty unconvincing because these babies are just sitting there and they're SJWing.
So innocent. Yeah, they're so cute. And it's kind of interesting because the narrator is saying all of these things, right? The babies are just so innocent. And I think that's very telling of the liberal approach to social indoctrination. But the funny thing about this is apparently these kids can choose their own gender, which is yet to be determined. But their political ideology is totally set in stone. Like, I don't think any of those children are going to be joining the priesthood.
Right. Wow. That's so interesting. Well, of course not. Well, I mean, it's almost like T-Mobile wanted to win the hearts of America's overwhelmingly single SJW community by convincing them that T-Mobile is actually literally breeding SJW babies to join the resistance when they grow up. And you're right. The impression they gave was we have basically an SJW hatchery, and we're going to be... We've already decided what they think and what they're going to believe throughout their lives. It is creepy.
Yeah, well, and that's cute in all of them. But when it comes down to it, conservative Catholics are going to so outnumber children whose parents feed them that garbage. So I'm pretty optimistic about the future of at least my own progeny and our listeners. Challenge accepted.
Right. So speaking of babies and toddlers, I wanted to also bring up another topic, which is that Tide Pods look too delicious, apparently. And New York City is trying to outlaw Big Gulp Tide Pods, which are, no, not Big Gulp, but just Tide Pods. They look too delicious. They look too delicious, and they don't want them to get into the hands of kids. And so New York is seriously thinking about passing a bill to do something with how delicious Tide Pods look and make the company change their look. Isn't that right?
Yeah, my first response to hearing this was, I'm so glad that I no longer live in Brooklyn because things are just getting out of hand. But I just think Chuck Schumer said that he made that funny comment about the fact that they look appetizing to him.
Yes.
It's like he needs a bill to protect himself from his own weird, strange addiction pica thing.
It's a New York thing, apparently. Chuck Schumer, yes.
I mean, maybe that's why he's been so unbending on immigration. I don't know. It's just like it's getting to his head.
The idea, yeah, that we have to pass a bill to protect New York City Democrats from eating Tide Pods because they're essentially just like the toddlers. This isn't good.
Yeah. I mean, if you read the letter that these legislators sent to Procter & Gamble, the creator of Tide, they're talking about specifically making these pods unappealing and bad tasting or worse tasting for children. But if you look at the reports of the spike in poison control calls, they're all children 13 and older. So they're not really children, they're teens with rational faculties. I mean, it just comes down to the fact that you can't outlaw stupidity and free will.
Well, right. And I would imagine this is like the Tide Pod Challenge is part of it. I mean, this happens every so often. Another one I remember about a decade ago, teenagers were strangling themselves for fun. And just these challenges, they go viral online. I mean, I hate to say it, but it reminds me of the Darwin Awards. I mean, that was the whole point of the Jackass movies, too. Remember? It's like, look at these. Can you believe how stupid these people are risking their lives for basically a thrill?
Right. And I think it's 100% worse in the age of social media where things go viral in an instant and you have all these impressionable young teens and young adults trying out these challenges so that they'll get more YouTube followers. And it really is sad, but I don't want to laugh too much at the Darwinian comment, but I think that's exactly right. I mean, you're going to have people who are caving to social pressure, and it's just so silly to try to legislate against something like this that's completely completely beyond the law.
Right. Well, I called this on Twitter when I first saw the bill being proposed. I said, this is a flagrant violation of civil liberties and of the principle of survival of the fittest or something to that
Yes,
effect.
I saw that. I love that.
But anyway, yeah, this has been a completely pointless interview, but I'm glad that we had this talk about Tide Pods, Chuck Schumer, and baby gender wage gap LGBT ideology.
Thanks for wasting my time. It's not like I have a child to care for or anything, Stephen. No, this is very fun, and I'll tell Michael about it one day.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Carly. I can't wait to have you on the show again.
Thank you.
And now the time has come for our weekly political discussion with Catholic Vote Political Director Josh Mercer, the editor of The Loop. How are you, Josh?
I'm doing okay. A little bit of a cold, though, but I'll trudge through.
A little bit of a cold, but you'll trudge through. Isn't that just life in a nutshell? In our fallen world. Well, this week we've been hearing a lot of talk about paid family leave.
Well, I mean, you ask Americans, should there be paid family leave for parents at the time they have a newborn child? Should they get like 6 to 8 weeks of paid family leave? The American people support it by like greater than 70%. We're about the only industrialized nation that doesn't mandate it. So it's not like it's really controversial. What's the controversy is, how do we go about paying for it? Because so many people are employed in our country through small businesses. And anytime you tack on a mandate,
right,
it gets expensive. And so you force a business to pay for a worker for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever it is, when there's no one else to take their spot. So you're basically paying for 2 people or whatever for that time frame. And a big company like a Target or a Walmart might be actually in favor of it. This is one of those tricks about economics that people get confused by. You think about something like this and you would think, oh, well, a big corporation that loves money and worships money, they're not going to want something like paid family leave. Well, if you're talking about a law that would mandate it on every employer in the country, if you're Walmart, then you just, you can bear that cost a lot easier. But that small mom and pop shop that's teetering on the edge, it might put them out of business. And so it's actually a competitive advantage for something like Walmart to do that. So that's why, in fact, Republicans don't really have a problem with paid family leave, but their concern would be, we don't want to put small businesses under. So is there a different way of going about it? Now, the first thing that was done on this was the recently passed tax bill. Senator Deb Fischer, she's a Republican from Nebraska, was pushing hard for a tax break, because one of the major things about the tax reform bill was trying to reform corporate taxes, which were sky high 35%, brought it down to 21%. But in the process of that bill, they put in an incentive for companies to offer paid family leave. It was a tax break for companies that would offer that to their employees, much the same way we have a tax benefit for companies that offer healthcare insurance. Now, here's the thing. Back when Harry Truman was president and the Democrats were trying to socialize healthcare, Republicans in Congress said, whoa. Let's give a tax break to businesses instead. Let them offer healthcare.
Right.
And that's how we've had healthcare in the last 70 years tied to our employment. Well, there's challenges with that, to be sure, but it was better than having our healthcare nationalized 70 years ago.
Right.
So it just started, the law. And already Walmart and Target and a few other companies are saying, we're going to offer this benefit to our employees. So that's a great win for working families. The concern here is there might be a lot of small businesses out there that might not be able to make as much of an advantage of that tax break as somebody like Walmart. And so they may not offer that to their employees. What can you do for maybe small businesses? And also, obviously, nonprofits don't pay corporate taxes. So how do you give, is there any other system that we could do, some other incentive that we could offer paid family leave without throwing it on as an expensive mandate to the employers?
Right.
And that's what's going on right now. This week, they're kicking around this new idea. It was started by Kristen Shapiro and Andy Biggs. They're affiliated with the American Enterprise Institute. And they said, well, why don't we do something else different here? We don't need to create a new government program. We don't even necessarily have to start a new tax, which would cause a lot of issues in Congress, especially controlled by the Republicans. We just cut taxes. We don't want to raise taxes. So their idea was, wait a minute, what if you let working families take 6 weeks of paid family leave and you just withdraw it from your own Social Security? So you're not creating a new government program. You're already operating within the Social Security program.
Right.
You're not taxing anybody else. If you decide to take this benefit, you're not charging anybody else for it.
Right.
The way it would be paid for, the way it would be revenue neutral would be that instead of collecting Social Security benefits at age 67, you just delay it 6 weeks.
Right. Well, and also,
you see what I'm saying?
This has got to be, I would imagine a lot of young people would find this interesting because they literally have completely despaired of ever getting their Social Security upon retirement, which would be in, 4 decades.
Right, exactly. And part of the reason why is because the baby boomers did not have as many children as other generations, and that problem is sort of accelerated. But we definitely need pro-natalist policies, have more children. I mean, the government's not going to be able to convince people necessarily have more babies. There's some of these campaigns out European countries, it kind of comes off as ridiculous. I don't think that really ever works. But I do think a lot of working families struggle to pay the bills, and they think, well, maybe we want another kid, but can we afford it? If you can make it more affordable, then if they want to have children, they'll have children.
Right.
You're not going to convince someone who doesn't want to have a kid by paying them. That's not what this is about. But I do think this is a proposal that just came out. It deserves to be explored. And I think for the reasons you said, millennials might look at this and say, I don't think I'm going to collect Social Security in 40 years anyway, so why not give this a go?
Right.
The main reason I like it is it's not a new government program. It's not a new tax. And you're not throwing it all on small businesses.
Which is extremely important. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, because there were earlier proposals for paid family leave that really rubbed me the wrong way. And it was sort of split conservatives. Some conservatives who were more big government conservatives were like pro-natalist. I don't care how we pay for it, right? Let's raise taxes or whatever. And others were more like me, a little bit more libertarian leaning. They're like, this is a horrible idea. This is basically a planned economy kind of idea, and it's going to hurt us. So I'm glad that they're at least looking for a solution. But the other thing that's funny with this is two of the main leaders in this push for paid family leave have been Marco Rubio and Ivanka Trump. And I keep thinking to myself, in this case and many other cases of policy disputes with the Trump administration, here's a racial minority, a Latino guy, and a liberal woman. Ivanka is a liberal, frankly. They're working together to come up with a policy that it's not a very, on the face of it, conservative idea, certainly not a libertarian one. And so this Latino and this woman who's a liberal are working together to get this policy that is kind of a big government policy on face value at first. Why aren't Democrats happy?
They might be. I mean, we'll see. I mean, what they might, but of course they would say, well, let's go the further step and let's mandate it and let's do it through a tax because they like to have government-based solutions more than anything else.
Right.
But some libertarians are like less government altogether. And I guess I'm sympathetic to that. But I guess my concern would be if you don't do something with this now, then in 2 years, Democrats will run on this and they will have a government program and they will have it pay for it either through a new tax or just adding to the deficit or whatever. So this is at least a way that you do it without creating a new plan. Here's the thing. Are you going to stop this train? Maybe you can. Maybe we'll get the libertarian dreamland. Fine. In lieu of that, what's the best way to try to solve this need without vastly increasing the size of the welfare state? And I think this plan, which basically says, if you want it, go ahead, take that money now, and then we'll just delay your Social Security benefits by 6 weeks. I think that's a pretty good plan. And it doesn't prevent employers from offering it. It doesn't prevent employers from, like I say, taking this new tax benefit to lower their taxes by offering it as a benefit to their employees. So Democrats had super majorities in the House and the Senate, and President Barack Obama in power. They didn't move on immigration. They didn't move on paid family leave. They wasted their time wrecking our healthcare system.
Right.
And what's happened? Republicans now, with a Republican president, Republican House and Senate, they've already cut taxes for working families. They've already offered a tax incentive to help businesses create this benefit for paid family leave for their employees. Now they're trying to take it another step. So I give them credit for moving on these problems that have been around for a while. Democrats had the opportunity to move forward with it when they had both houses of Congress and the presidency, and they didn't do it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Josh. This has been what a great, clear description of this debate. This has really been fantastic. Thank you for that. So we look forward to hearing the update on it. We're probably going to be hearing more about this, and we want to keep in the loop on this and other topics. And how do we do that?
Subscribe to our free daily news briefing. It's called The Loop. Just go to CatholicVote.org/loop and get you signed up for free.
All right. Thanks very much, Josh. Talk to you soon. And now it's time for our brief weekly interview with Professor Jeffrey Stimson. Now, Professor Stimson, there's recently been a very disturbing trend in the LGBT movement, dressing up 10-year-old boys in drag and otherwise sexualizing them and involving them in LGBT activism, a trend that's so disturbing that even gay men such as Chad Felix Green are sounding the alarm. Now, isn't this kind of sexualization a lot like what criminal investigators call grooming? And isn't it true that many today feel uncomfortable questioning the LGBTQ movement for fear of moral opprobrium? And doesn't that make this situation similar to the one in Boston just before the Catholic sex abuse scandal broke, where Catholics saw suspicious behavior between predator priests and boys but didn't feel comfortable accusing clerics? And given all of that, isn't it pretty inappropriate that in the wake of the Catholic sex abuse scandal, Father James Martin and other clerics are pushing to further normalize the LGBTQ movement in the church, even as gay men like Chad Felix Green are trying to slam on the brakes from within the LGBTQ community? Yes. This has been our brief weekly interview with Professor Jeffrey Stimson. I'm joined now by Dr. J.W. Richards, executive editor of a great publication called The Stream, which you can find at stream.org, and also the host of the recently launched A Force for Good, a show on EWTN about how subsidiarity and business saves lives and souls. Is that an accurate description, Jay?
Stephen, that's a great description. I think maybe we'll use that for the motto going forward. That's a perfect summary.
I'll send you my banking information. But anyway, thank you very much for coming on, Jay.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
I want to get right into the fact that you have always been, and throughout your career, you, I think, really exemplify this wonderful marriage between faith and reason, sort of unapologetic confrontation of secularism to say, what are you talking about? You think you're so unique. What's so special about you with your science? We've always had this.
That's right. I appreciate you picking that up, because sometimes people say, Jay, you've written about science, you've written about environmental ethics, you write about economics. What are you doing? Those look unrelated, but in my own mind, they are an expression of my conviction, both when I was an evangelical and then more recently since I've become Catholic. The gospel just applies to everything. And there's not just simple, okay, this is church stuff over here, and then there's economic questions over here. I think we've got enough specialization. It's great that people specialize, but I think we need more work at this sort of intersection of these spheres. And even if I'm writing about economics or I'm writing about latest discoveries in astronomy, it's an expression of this conviction that, in fact, to quote the Reformed theologian Abraham Kuyper from a century ago, that there's not one square inch over all creation over which Christ does not declare mine. And so if we don't know how the gospel applies to some particular question, that's usually a sign that we haven't thought deeply enough either about the gospel or about the subject.
So what you're saying, Jay, is that you're a theocrat.
Honestly, I think if we were having this interview on NPR, that's what someone would think. They wouldn't, so you're saying that everybody should be forced to be Christian. No, absolutely not. In fact, I think the idea of individual conscience and the protection of human conscience is absolutely important. And I think if you think religious liberty is a good idea and ought to be preserved, try to make a coherent argument for that doesn't actually presuppose the Christian view of the human person as a creature made in the image of God with dignity. I can make that argument as a Catholic. That's actually very hard, if not impossible, to make on secular grounds.
You're, of course, the executive editor and co-founder of this publication, The Stream, which is a very impressive extension of your character and worldview, I think, not exclusively yours. But I like how that website, as a news source and as a source of analysis, it has this sort of, we assume Christian orthodoxy and to some extent Jewish orthodoxy, small O's, as just sort of, that's our worldview. What about it? You would be the aggressor if you had a problem with that or if you questioned that. But it's just sort of the basis by which we think, what of it? And then you write analysis. Yes. It's a really refreshing thing. This is a long-winded question, but it gets back to a problem that I often have with what's called apologetics, which spends all of its time on the defensive before it ever gets to the point of actually saying, okay, I can lay claim to some knowledge and some analysis in this world.
Absolutely. In fact, that's really what we wanted to do, because there's so many terrific online news and commentary sites. There's so many good Christian and Catholic publications. And so James Robison, my evangelical friend and sometime co-author, and I said, okay, what would fill a need? And we thought, well, first of all, let's create a platform in which very serious evangelicals and serious Catholics can come together around the things that we share in common, not lowest common denominator ecumenism where we all kind of check our faith at the door. Let's be who we are, but do it together. And then also let's take what we know and believe as Christians for granted and not be afraid to write about not just abortion and marriage, but economics and tax policy and immigration. Try to do those things with integrity. But the reality is what you tend to have, especially on the internet now, is you have a lot of very well-established Christian publications that are usually specific, either Catholic or evangelical or charismatic. Right. And then you have conservative publications like National Review, where, of course, there are many, many Christians and religious people there, but it's not all kind of baked into the pudding. We wanted all that to be baked into the pudding. So it's not going to be just a Christian publication that talks about Christian things, but a Christian publication that talks about everything and does it unapologetically and unselfconsciously.
Right. Well, enough about you. Catholic Vote. No, but I like that approach. I emulate that approach without sending you royalties, and I'm grateful for it.
That's true.
But you've brought that same perspective, I think, to EWTN airwaves with the new show A Force for Good. What is it that made you approach specifically business, which is something most people would not associate as you and Kuiper would with the faith? Why would you make that the focal point, and how's that gone?
It's gone, honestly, really, really well. And in many ways, you're right. This is another reflection of this basic idea. It's also a reflection of the view of the Bush School of Business and Economics at Catholic University of America here in D.C. I'm on the faculty.
Right.
And we believe, it's a business school at the Catholic University of America. We think the faith has something to say to business. And we also think that Catholics that want to be rational and know what they're talking about in business and economics need to learn about those subjects. And it turns out EWTN had exactly the same view. EWTN hasn't covered business and economics much, but really that's just simply because the station has grown enough to where it's a natural thing to do. Of course, it effectively started in Mother Angelica's garage, in Alabama, and
Right.
Has become this amazing Catholic international media company with a terrific studio right here in Washington, D.C. And so it was a natural partnership between the Bush School at Catholic U and EWTN. And so we just had our first fall season, which are in reruns if people want to see it. It's on several times during the week, but on the East Coast at 10 p.m. on Friday nights. And we've just started producing our second season, which will be airing this spring. And we start by telling about great entrepreneurs and people in the business world. There are also people of faith. Then we move into studio where I interview somebody about some complicated economic issue that Catholics think about. And so we're going to eventually cover all of these things. And honestly, in many ways, it's like an apostolate like Opus Dei or the Benedictines as they started, right. Or at Labora, pray and work, both of those things. So it's not like, well, I have my spiritual stuff that I do when I go to Mass. And then I have work, and those are two different universes. No, that's not how it is. It's all God's world.
Reminds me of the wisdom of wives that comedian Gary Shandling shared. He became a Buddhist, and he says, this is why Buddha wasn't married. His wife would say, hey, Buddha, why do you just sit around the house all day? He says, well, I'm meditating. She says, well, why don't you meditate while you take out the trash?
That's right. Turns out you can pray the rosary while you're taking out the trash.
Right. Yeah. Well, it also is why I'm glad I'm not a Buddhist. It would be even harder to marry than
Seriously.
No, but it is true, though, that the people do lose that connection. It's very similar to the way in which many Catholics become what is called fideists. They lose the connection between their practical duties in the world and their faith, and sometimes to the point of becoming heretics and unreasonable, not thinking rightly. And this phenomenon has happened in the church where when you think Catholicism and the principles of it, you think of principles that happen to be very much in vogue among elites. It's because I think Catholicism, or some representatives of Catholicism, have sort of sold themselves, and they've forgotten in their pitch, in their job interview to have influence, they've forgotten some of their principles. And for an example, I went to a job interview once at an institution that'll remain nameless. It's an intellectual institution. My interviewer said something about, so what do you know about Catholic social teaching? I see you're a Catholic. And I said, I'm a big fan of Catholic social teaching, especially subsidiarity. I think that's a really underrated principle. And he said, oh, that's easy. What about solidarity? And I always remembered that and thought, no, that's not easy, sir. No. That's the one that's most forgotten. Solidarity happens to be the one that rhymes the best with what's popular among elites. What do you think?
I mean, that is That's absolutely true. I mean, very often when people invoke the term Catholic social teaching, it's sort of a stand-in for kind of secular progressive politics or something like that. Well, that's not what it is at all. And John Paul II said, look, don't think of Catholic social teaching as a third thing or as a halfway point between socialism and capitalism. It's its own thing. It provides us with moral principles of reflection that are based both on special revelation, but also open and accessible to human reason. And you're exactly right. What we want to do is kind of appeal to elements or words like solidarity, which go undefined. And no one's going to frown at you at the New York Times if you talk and praise solidarity.
Right.
They're going to scratch their heads if you say subsidiarity. And if you tell them, well, it means that all things being equal, you want the kind of body or institution closest to a problem to be the one that deals with it.
Right.
And only if they break down should the higher jurisdiction take over. And so this protects the dignity and the rights of the individual against the state and the tribe. It protects the church and gives it a proper jurisdiction and limits the jurisdiction of the state. And I think that's the genius of Catholic social teaching. And we at the business school at Catholic University, we focus primarily on subsidiarity, solidarity, human dignity, and the common good. I mean, there's no official complete list of the principles of Catholic social teaching, but we think those four, as long as they're defined properly, give you a really good kind of moral and metaphysical base to think about all of these issues, especially in business and economics. And what I find mostly among Catholic business people, it's not a kind of radical dualism or heresy. It's just a compartmentalization in which they think, well, to be a good business person, I'm going to have to be, a little bit underhanded and a little bit Darwinian in my kind of treatment of my fellow human beings. But I don't like that, but I don't know how to do business. In fact, we say, actually, if you do this right, you're going to be able to do good and do well at the same time. I'm absolutely convinced that if you serve people and treat them kindly and think about what your customers need, what your employees need, that's not just going to be good for your soul. That's going to be good for your business long term. Yeah, maybe you can make a buck cutting corners in short term, but long term, the universe, it tends toward justice ultimately. And if you act in a way that's appropriate to the way God wants us to act, I think that you're going to find results in that.
Right. One of the problems with asserting the kind of worldview that you're trying to assert, certain Catholic leaders, I'm talking, of course, about the USCCB and certain bishops who make statements about this, that, and the other,
Yes.
especially economic plan. Recently, of course, we were talking about that tax reform, which one bishop called unconscionable.
Mm-hmm.
That's some very strong language for a tax cut. What do we do with that kind of very strong language from Catholic leaders, and how does it make you feel, Jay?
How does it make me feel? A little frustrated, I suppose. I mean, I would say, look, any bishop has a perfect right to make an argument in the public square just as much as anyone else. I think it's a really bad idea when bishops and bishops' conferences act as if Catholic teaching is sort of dispositive on every policy issue. I mean, that cheapens the truths of the faith. And so, for instance, the Bishops' Conference had over 300 sort of policy statements last year. That's almost one per day.
Wow.
It sort of reached its nadir when the Bishops' Conference weighed in on net neutrality. And at least I think on economic grounds, on the wrong side.
Right.
But in some ways, whatever side they were on, why is the Bishops' Conference weighing in on something that is so obviously a matter for prudential judgment and is going to be in the jurisdiction of people who are experts on communications legislation and things like that? It's just very strange. And so I think the Bishops' Conference ends up blunting its witness by treating all of these issues as if they're just sort of equally susceptible to a Catholic answer. There is not one Catholic answer to net neutrality or to the exact details of the tax plan or whatever. I mean, there are principles that we can apply, but in a lot of these cases, you're dealing with prudential judgments in which, even if I think a fellow Catholic is wrong about, I'd prefer a different marginal income tax rate, it would never occur to me to say, oh no, Catholic social teaching requires it to be this way. I mean, it's just silly. And I think it just, honestly, it mutes our public witness.
Right. I was just talking on last week's episode about how someone confronted me with the question, what would Jesus do?
Mm-hmm.
And what she really meant by that was, aren't you ashamed to disagree with my politics, which Jesus agrees with? And I thought Jesus said something about tax reform.
I know.
didn't catch that.
I need to find that. When people, and the problem with the what would Jesus do is that that's actually not the relevant moral question. Jesus had a unique mission. There are lots of things he would not do and didn't do that we're supposed to do. So the relevant question is, what would Jesus have me do? That's the moral question. And so people use that to preach pacifism, and there could be no Catholic people in the military and all sorts of kind of mischief from that. It's a tougher question, but a closer to the right one to say, what would Jesus in my particular circumstances with my vocation have me do?
Right. And from a sort of innocent, fresh Catholic perspective, it sounds impious at first to hear, hey, you know what? When it comes to economics, Thomas Sowell is a stronger authority than your bishop because Thomas Sowell is an economist.
Yeah.
It also happens to be the case that I tell people, I wrote to the Vatican and asked if it's possible to canonize a living agnostic because of Thomas Sowell. But anyway, go ahead.
No, that's right. I mean, the reality is when it comes to economics is more difficult than, say, chemistry. There's not a uniquely Catholic take on the periodic table of elements. It's God's world. It has a certain logic to it. You study the chemical part of reality and you discover this amazing structure. And it's the same for everyone. Economics is slightly more complicated. On the one hand, there are economic truths. At the same time, because you're dealing with human persons and with a human society, morality and ethics and anthropology are never far behind when you're talking about economics. So I discover with any student that takes an economic course or wants to talk about these things, they're not interested in studying the inelasticity of demand. They're interested in, what do we do to help poor people? Why are some countries poor and some rich? In other words, the moral question and the descriptive question, what the world is like, are always sewn in closely together when it comes to economics. And so that's why we tend to get kind of confused on these things. My argument is what we want to do as Catholics is we want to integrate the best moral principles from Catholic social teaching with the best empirical discoveries and theoretical insights of good economists. We have to adopt Thomas Sowell's worldview. We do need to look carefully at his understanding of the function of prices and supply and demand. We're not free to disregard that because he happens not to be Catholic.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up the fact that many young people especially, they approach economics with urgent moral passion. They're not approaching it with disinterest. In fact, many of them who end up falling into the sort of Marxist direction were originally motivated by a sort of Franciscan urgent moral concern for the poor. And then they end up going massively wrong.
That's right.
But we were talking earlier about subsidiarity and about Catholic social teachings, very roughly speaking, from the ground up principle in economics. And it is morally urgent. And you've written about this extensively and debated about it extensively. Subsidiarity has saved lives and can save more. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. I also think subsidiarity is a gift that the church needs to give to the rest of the world. It's not a uniquely Catholic idea. There are some Protestant scholars that have developed and even used the word subsidiarity, but it's been talked about mostly by name among Catholics and among popes. And I think what the sort of genius of subsidiarity is that says, not just human beings are social beings. We, of course, know that. We're born into families and into societies. But it says that our social relations have their own unique characteristics. They're not all the same. So parents and children, that's one type of social relationship. Employee, employer, that's another kind of relationship. Priest, layperson, that's another one. So we're not just social, but there are these very specific characteristics of social relations at different levels and different jurisdictions. And if we want society to prosper and we want to pursue the common good, we need to attend to those rather than running roughshod over the kind of right kinds of relationships so that suddenly the parent-child relationship is replaced by the bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. child relationship. Those aren't the same thing.
Right. Well, and also, what about the actual, there's a very practical storyline of nations which have previously been heavily centralized. When they inject, even cynically, for their own self-interest, when governments inject a little element of freedom in their economies, it has lifted people out of poverty and in some cases lifted them out of danger.
Absolutely. The position that I think gives us greater responsibility in 2018 than Christians had, say, 100 years ago. 150 years ago, no one had actually tried to entirely centrally plan an economy. And so I think if some Catholic writer was saying certain things about socialism in the mid-19th century, he was kind of speculating, but he didn't have a whole lot of data to go on. The 20th century has given us a lot of data about the forms of political economy that kill people and cause people to starve to death, and ones in which people are capable of prospering and flourishing and exercising their sort of dominion as creatures made in the image of God.
Right.
So not only do we have moral principles we need to attend to, but those moral principles can be informed by empirical observations of the 20th century experience.
In other words, you can say definitively after a certain point, well, that idea is discredited. So say this many corpses.
That's right. And I mean, honestly, that's what I thought. I was in college absolutely transfixed by these economic and moral questions, was myself a socialist for a while, graduated from college, and then the Soviet Union collapsed and Eastern Europe opened up. And I thought, well, that's an argument that's been settled. So it's boring to talk about that. It was only another 10 years. I'd been writing on the intersection of faith and science, ended up on college campuses, including Christian college campuses, found out all the dumb ideas I had about economics in the 1980s were alive and well in the minds of freshmen in 2000, unfortunately. Right. And so I think these ideas and these arguments, they have to be made anew to every generation. There's always something attractive about socialism, especially if you're allowed to populate it with these pleasing mental pictures actually than the actual data of socialism in the 20th century.
Right. And there's something, in my opinion, even more attractive to the human heart in the truth. That's been a wonderful thing. Actually, I'm going to give you a little compliment. This is something I was just thinking about before we got on the phone. Jay, I knew you for a number of years before I realized you were Catholic.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I don't mean that in a bad way.
Sure.
You don't immediately say, hello, my name is Jay St. Augustine Richards, and here's my son, St. John Paul II.
That's right.
And I go to daily mass and da-da-da-da-da. In other words, that ostentatious presentation wasn't there. Rather, you were saying, hey, so I've studied some things and I know some things about how to avoid human misery. And that's the primary presentation. I think that's very attractive in a way that's in many ways better than, hey, guess what? I'm going to tell you why everyone should be Catholic.
Well, it's funny because when I became Catholic, I have a priest friend whom I had worked with, and I won't mention his name. People would know him, I'm sure, who told a mutual friend, somebody needs to lock Jay up for a year right after I converted. And what he was thinking was, Jay is immediately going to go into Catholic apologetics, and I think he's supposed to do something different. And he was right. I have a lot of friends that do that, but I honestly feel like my vocation is, I'm a public Catholic, and it's obvious if you ask me certain questions, but I try to be bilingual so that what I say makes sense to Catholics and to faithful Protestants as well. And especially when we're talking about things that are available to public reason and are public evidence, I think we want to do our best to make it public, appeal to premises that you share in common with the people you're discussing things with. And of course, at the stream, as an editorial policy, even though people write as Catholics or Protestants, we're very careful to try to say stuff that resonates with people on the other side rather than alienating them.
That's right. Now, one last thing I've got to just stuff into this interview because it's such a cool fact is the fact that you went toe-to-toe at one point in a debate with the late, great atheist Christopher Hitchens, Ben Stein moderating, and that must have been awesome. So my plain question is, how awesome was that?
It was I have to say when it happened, I mean, it's been 10 years ago exactly now. It was in late January 2008. It was at Stanford University, and it was broadcast live to hundreds of churches around North America. And I thought, okay, what am I going to need to do next? It was one of those moments. And for me, the goal was just don't embarrass myself, stick with the argument. He won't. He will wax eloquent on other things, and don't headbutt Hitchens before it's over. And so by my own criteria, I managed to pull through.
Excellent. Well, I like Hitchens, but he's, in a way, and I don't mean this as an insult to him, not as intelligent as people thought he was in a way. He was very breviloquent and stentorian and good at appearing intelligent, which is something that's right. The best I can hope to do. So I've always admired that in him.
Well, and you're exactly right. You've nailed his thinking, especially when it came to theology. He was just a complete simpleton. And so you could sort of show that. And so I would say after the broadcast and everything was over, the San Francisco Atheist Club came down to the front of the stage and kind of chastised him for not staying focused. He's used to arguing in front of audiences that wouldn't notice what the topic was, whereas in this case, I think it didn't serve him as well.
When you're as dazzling as him, I don't blame him. All right. Well, thank you very much, Jay, for joining us on the program, and I look forward to having you on again soon. And in the meantime, What are we going to tell our listeners to do to check out? What would you like them to check out in terms of your work?
Hey, check out The Force for Good on EWTN, and check out the stream at stream.org, where I and many colleagues write about these things every day.
All right. Well, God rest the great soul of Christopher Hitchens, and God bless you and yours, and we'll talk to you again soon, Jay.
Thank you.
I'm not gonna get home.
You know, I hear often, very often, maybe a little too often, about principle, how important it is to be principled. Be principled, don't abandon your principles, 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 principles. I hear about it all the time. And it's true, you should be principled, and principles do matter, but not if you don't really understand what it means to be principled or what principles are in the right sense. And I'm convinced a lot of people don't know what this means, because half the people I have known who talked a lot about principle were very unprincipled people. Now, how can a person who talks about principle all the time not be principled? How can he fool himself like that? Well, here's how. Being quote-unquote principled is often misused as a cover. It's used as an excuse not to be prudent. The virtue of prudence is extremely important because it makes it necessary for us to apply virtues and principles correctly, and the right principles correctly, in the right place at the right time with the right people in the right way. This is very, very important. Now, let me give you some examples. The truth of Scripture, all right? Scripture is inerrant, inspired by God. There's no error in it. There are no lies in Scripture. But you don't walk in on a man mercilessly beating his wife and take that moment to say, "Wives, be submissive to your husbands." I mean, that's a quote from Scripture. It's not a lie, but you're a jerk if you use it at that moment, right? So that's an example of, that's how a person can be principled or apply a principle in a way that's imprudent. It's not right. It's not in the right time or the right place in the right way with the right people. And this is also the sort of thinking that tends to mislead us into completely quashing or killing certain things like anger. I think of this often. Anger is a great example. There's a quote that St. Thomas Aquinas quotes in his Summa Theologica. He says, "He who is not angry when he has cause to be angry sins." It's sinful not to be angry when you should be angry. Again, this is prudence. He says, "For an unreasonable patience is the hotbed of many vices. It fosters negligence and incites not only the wicked, but even the good to do wrong," right? To forbear evil, to be patient in the face of certain evils. To not be angry when you should be angry is wrong. So you can't just say, well, I'm principled. I have a principle against anger or against losing my patience or so forth. And this is why, as I mentioned, some of the people that I've known who talked the most about principle were some of the least principled people I knew. You know why? Because, as my friend Jason often says, they were perfectly reliable, except when it counts. Without prudence, you cannot rise to the occasion in a truly virtuous way. So it's really important. Don't be just principled. You can be principled, but principle isn't the whole story. Well, that's it for this week. You've been listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour, the show that leaves you aching to subscribe on YouTube, iTunes, and Google Play. Just FYI, we've moved the release date permanently from Thursday to Friday from now on. I'm your host, Stephen Herreid. See you next week.